In the back alley of a town that God forgot, where dust and regret settled in equal measure, she was a ghost before she was even dead. Tethered to a hitching post like a stray animal, she couldn't have been more than 12, her head bowed against the brutal sun. The sounds of laughter and gambling from the saloon were a world away. Men saw her, they spat, they looked away. She was just another piece of the town's casual cruelty. But on that day, a writer named Jesse Boone, a man who thought he was done with the world's troubles, saw her too. And his horse stopped, as if it knew a debt was about to be paid, one that had nothing to do with money. A sharp tug on the rope silenced the flies for a moment. The small figure tethered to the hitching rail stumbled, a faint whimper escaping her lips before being swallowed by the oppressive heat of the alley. She was a thing of sharp angles beneath. A threadbare cotton shift, her bare feet disappearing into the filth, her face hidden by a curtain of matted hair. All around her, the afternoon wore on with brutal indifference. From the saloon came the tinny notes of a piano and men's laughter. But out here, there was only the sun and the silent suffering. $10, a voice rasped. It belonged to a weasel-faced man leaning against the saloon's back wall. She's stronger than she looks. $10 and she's your problem, not mine. A few onlookers grunted, their interest already fading. It was just another sad story in a land full of them. Then, the shadow of a horse and rider fell over the scene. The horse stopped dead, its intuition sensing the tension in the air before its rider even processed the sight. The man in the saddle, Jesse Boone, let out a slow breath. He'd come to town for salt and nails, a simple errand. He had no business with the souls lost and found in the gutters of this town. Yet his gaze locked on the child and the world. Narrowed to that single, wretched point, his boots made almost no sound in the thick dust as he dismounted. He walked past the weasel-faced man, his presence a quiet but undeniable force that made the man stand up a little straighter. Jesse stopped before the girl, his shadow providing a small measure of relief from the sun. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat. "I'm not in the business of buying people," Jesse said, his voice low and steady as he dropped a few heavy coins into the man's outstretched palm. "Consider the gambler's slate wiped clean." The man pocketed the coins with a sneer and vanished back inside the saloon. Jesse knelt, the motion making his joints ache, and with a swift cut from his pocketknife, the rope fell away. The girl swayed, her legs giving out from under her. He caught her, his arms circling her awkwardly. She was lighter than a sack of feed. She didn't look at him, didn't cry. She just trembled, a leaf in a storm. They left the town behind them as dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple. He had put her on the mule, and he walked alongside, leading both animals toward the silhouette of them. Bluffs. Not a single word passed between them. The front steps of his small house groaned a protest under his weight. The place was weathered, solitary, a reflection of the man who lived within it. He led her inside to the main room, sparse and clean, where the only real warmth came from the embers glowing in the fireplace. He pointed to a cot. "You can sleep there." She stood by the door, a small frozen statue. He ladled some leftover stew into a bowl and placed it on the table. She approached it slowly, as if it were a trap, and stared at the spoon. He watched her try to remember what to do with it. It struck him then, she wasn't just hungry for food, she was starved of decency. "Go on," he said gently. "It's yours," she ate, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she was done, she whispered a thank you so faint he almost missed it. As night fell, he checked the fire and turned to her. "Doors stay open in this house," he told her. It was a promise. He slept in the armchair, a shotgun resting nearby. A sound woke him deep in the night. She was standing in the moonlight filtering through the window, her eyes wide with a terror that wasn't of this room, but of memory. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, Don't put me in the dark place." He sat perfectly still. "I won't," he said into the charged silence. "Not now. Not ever." She retreated to her cot. But in the quiet darkness of the small cabin, two souls remained wide awake until the coming of the dawn. Dawn broke cold and sharp, painting the eastern bluffs in a pale, rosy light. When Jesse rose, a familiar ache in his lower back reminding him of his years, he found the girl already awake. She wasn't moving, just sitting on the edge of the cot. Her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the single window as if waiting for a verdict from the rising sun. She moved through the house like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound, as if afraid the floorboards themselves might betray her presence. He gestured with his chin toward the wood stove. "There's kindling in the box." She went without a word, her small frame swallowed by the gray morning light. A routine began to form, unspoken and unwritten. He would handle the heavy work, the splitting of logs and the mending of tack. She would tend to the chickens and sweep the porch, her movements precise and thorough, born of a deep-seated fear of what might happen if a task was left undone. One morning, he fried up a pan of biscuits, the smell of hot lard and flour filling the small cabin with a scent of simple plenty. He placed two on a plate for her, golden brown and steaming, alongside a dollop of molasses. He watched her from across the table, pretending to be occupied with his own meal. She stared at the plate. Her hand hovered over it, then retreated. Finally she looked at him, her eyes wide with a genuine, troubling question. "Should I save one for later?" Jesse leaned back, the old chair groaning under his weight. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice even. "It's for you, child. There's more in the pan when that's gone." She blinked, processing the idea not as kindness, but as a puzzle she couldn't solve. She ate one biscuit, slowly, tearing off small pieces as if each bite were a theft. The other she left untouched. Weeks bled into one another. They moved in. A shared silence, a rhythm of chores and quiet meals. He learned the map of her fears. A raised voice on the wind would make her flinch. The slam of a distant gate would make her freeze. One evening, he found her huddled behind the rain barrel, her knees drawn to her chest, just watching the barn door. He didn't ask what she was doing. He knew. He just stood there for a while until she followed him back inside. A silent acknowledgement that he understood she wasn't hiding from him, but from a memory. The nearest neighbor, Hank Sutter, a man whose curiosity often outpaced his discretion, stopped by the well one afternoon. "New farmhand you got there, Jesse?" he asked, nodding toward the girl, who had vanished inside the moment his wagon appeared. "She's under my roof, Hank," Jesse said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "That's all a man needs to know." The first sign of a thaw came not as a word, but as a tune. It was a faint, wavering hum, off-key and quiet as a cricket song, that she would murmur to herself when she scattered grain for the hens, thinking he was out of earshot. He never let on that he heard it. One morning, she laid a single, resilient, plains primrose on the flat, unmarked stone that sat behind the house. It was the only marker for the grave of his wife, gone 5 years now. The gesture was so simple, so profound, it struck him silent for the rest of the day. That night, as the fire crackled, she whispered to the flames, "There was a boy." "Once." She said nothing more. He didn't ask. Spring arrived, coaxing green from the hard-packed earth. The air softened. The first time she smiled, it was a mistake. He'd been trying to patch a leaky bucket, and in his frustration, had managed to splash himself thoroughly with muddy water. A sound escaped her, not a laugh, not quite a giggle, but a choked-off bark of amusement. She clapped a hand over her mouth instantly, her eyes wide with panic. Jesse just looked down at his soaked trousers and grunted, "Glad one of us finds it funny." He saw her shoulders shake with a silent, hidden mirth. Her greatest fear revealed itself one night. They sat at the table, The ledger opened between them as he tallied up the cost of seed. She watched his pen scratch across the page for a long time before speaking. Will you sell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "When? You don't need me anymore?" He put the pen down. He looked at her, at this small scarred thing that had drifted into his life like a burr on a saddle blanket. He thought for a long time, searching for the right words. "The true words, I reckon," he said slowly. "That we were both in deep water. You were just in plain sight of it. And sometimes all a man can do is reach out a hand to pull the other fellow out." He paused. "I think you pulled too." She didn't respond, but the question never came again. The next evening, she approached him not with a question, but with a folded piece of coarse paper. He took it. Inside, written in shaky, meticulously formed letters, was a single word, "Lena." He looked at the paper, then at her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right then, Lena." A light bloomed in her eyes, a look of sheer relief, as if she had just been granted permission to exist. The next morning when Jesse came in from the barn, a mug of coffee was waiting for him on the table, steam rising in the cool air. She had poured it for him. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at her, and for the first time since his wife had been laid to rest under that flat stone, Jesse Boone let out a real, honest laugh. It was a rusty sound, but it was a start. The change came subtly at first. The constant chatter of the cicadas faded into an unnerving silence. The air, usually alive with the scent of pine and dust, went still and heavy, holding its breath. Jesse felt it in the marrow of his bones. A deep, primal knowing that something was wrong. His old dog, who spent most days sleeping in the sun, rose to its feet, a low growl rumbling in its chest as it stared down the long, empty road leading to the ranch. Jesse straightened up from the fence post he was mending, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. And then he saw them. 3 dark shapes shimmering in the heat, moving with a slowness that wasn't cautious, but arrogant. They rode as if they owned the land and everything on it. He didn't call for Lena. He simply walked toward the house, his stride unhurried, and waited on the porch. They dismounted before the gate, a calculated show of civility that did nothing to hide their purpose. The first was a preacher, a stout man with a Bible held like a shield and a starched collar so tight it seemed to choke. The kindness from his words. The second wore a cheap tin star pinned crookedly on his vest, his face impassive. The third man Jesse knew without being told. He had the same cruel set to his mouth as the gambler from town. It was Caleb Dawes. "Mr. Boone," the preacher began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I am Reverend Hatch. This is Deputy Slater, and this gentleman is Mr. Dawes." Jesse gave a single slow nod. "What business brings you out this far?" Caleb Dawes stepped forward, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jesse's boots. "There's a matter of a transaction my brother conducted in a moment of weakness. One he lacked the authority to make. I paid the man what he asked." Jesse said, his voice flat, "That coin doesn't make the transaction legal." The deputy interjected, his tone bored, as if reciting from a handbook. "There was a signed wager agreement. Under county law, the girl is chattel, property." "She's a child," Jesse stated, the words simple and hard as river stones, "not a sack of grain." Reverend Hatch gave a sorrowful sigh. "We are not here to debate the nature of things, Mr. Boone. We are here to return a lost lamb to her flock. You are harboring what is legally, and in the eyes of God, stolen property." Just then, the screen door creaked open. Lena stepped onto the porch. She wasn't hiding. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and though she was small, she held herself with a new stillness, her gaze steady. Caleb Dawes's lips curled into a smirk that didn't touch his cold eyes. "There she is." "Lena, child," the preacher said. his voice oozing a false gentleness. "Your family has come for you. This man has been misguided in his charity." She didn't move. Her eyes flicked to Jesse, then back to the men. "Girl," Caleb growled, his patience gone. "You heard the Reverend. You belong with us." Jesse took a single step forward, placing himself squarely between Lena and the men. The movement was slight but absolute. It was a line drawn in the dust. The deputy's hand drifted down, hovering near the worn handle of his pistol. The air grew thick enough to cut. 7 days, Jesse said, his voice quiet but carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. You come back with an order signed by a circuit judge. Or you don't come back at all. Reverend Hatch's face tightened. Stubbornness in the face of the law is a sin, Boone. And hiding behind a badge to steal a child is a damn sight worse, Jesse countered. For a long moment, no one moved. The 3 men exchanged glances, a silent calculation of risk. Finally, Caleb spat on the ground again. They mounted their horses and rode away, the dust swallowing them as quickly as it had produced them. The tension, however, remained, clinging to the air like humidity. Lena's voice was steady when she spoke. "They will be back." It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "Then the clock is running," she replied, turning back inside as if adding one more chore to her daily list. The week passed in a blur of strained, quiet and unspoken preparation. He showed her how to load and handle the old rifle, not to make her a fighter, but to banish the specter of helplessness from her eyes. Together, they repaired the west fence, their hands working in tandem, their silence a shared language. On the 6th night, she slept near the fire again, her breathing light and fitful. The 7th morning arrived, pale and windless. Jesse sat on the porch, a shotgun across his lap, watching the sun climb. Just after dawn, he heard the sound not the thud of horses, but the weary creak of wagon wheels. A single dilapidated wagon, pulled by a tired-looking mule, was making its way up the road. He stood, shotgun held ready. The wagon stopped. It wasn't the preacher, nor the lawman. A woman, no older than 30, but appearing twice that from hardship, climbed down slowly. Her dress was tattered, her face a mask of sun-baked grief. She took a few steps, her eyes scanning the ranch, and then she saw the small figure of the girl standing frozen on the porch. The woman's walking stick fell from her hand. Her breath caught in a ragged gasp. Lena's entire body trembled. A single word escaped her lips, a sound of disbelief and forgotten hope, a whisper that seemed to carry across the plains, "Mama." The woman Mara stumbled forward, her face a canvas of disbelief and pain. She fell to her knees in the dust before Lena, not with grace, but with the collapsing weight of years of grief. She clutched the girl as if trying to merge their 2 bodies into one, her sobs ragged and dry. "I looked for you," she choked out, her words buried in Lena's thin shoulder. "They told me you were gone. They lied." Lena's arms, at first stiff with shock, slowly came up to wrap around her mother's shaking frame. "They sold me, Mama," she said softly. Jesse stood apart, feeling like an intruder on a moment so sacred it felt as if the very land was holding its breath. He was a stranger to this deep, ragged history. After a time, Mara shakily got to her feet, leaning on Lena for support. "I have a place," she said, her voice thin but resolute. "A small shack over near Cotton Bend. It's not much, but it's ours. I came to bring you home, child." She looked at Jesse, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "Thank you for keeping her safe." Jesse just nodded, expecting to be left behind, his part in this story now concluded. But as Mara turned toward the wagon, Lena didn't follow. She looked at Jesse, her expression steady. "We'll need help," she said, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact, to make it safe. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. His throat felt tight. He looked from the mother, a ghost held together by sheer will; to the daughter, a sapling that had learned to grow in stone. There was only one answer he could give. The journey to Cotton Bend was a slow procession through a parched, unforgiving landscape. Jesse walked beside the weary mule, his hand resting near the harness, while mother and daughter rode in the back, a small island of rediscovered family. They spoke little. Words were insufficient for the chasm of time that had separated them. Instead, they shared bread and water, and at night, huddled together for warmth under a threadbare blanket Jesse provided. The shack appeared at sunset, leaning against a formation of red rock as if for support. It was a patchwork of scavenged timber and fading hope, a place that had endured more than it had prospered. Inside, it was swept clean but bare. A cot, a small table, a few jars on a shelf. Tacked to one wall was a child's drawing, the colors faded by the sun. Two small figures holding hands beneath a crooked, smiling sun. "You kept it," Lena whispered. Mara touched the drawing with a trembling finger. "It was all I had of you, that I could carry." They stayed for 2 days, a fragile peace settling over them. But on the third morning, Jesse tasted it on the wind. A sharpness that wasn't pine sap, a haze in the distance that wasn't morning mist. He climbed the rock formation behind the shack, and his gut clenched. To the west, the ridge was crowned with a line of hungry, orange light, a wildfire, moving east with the wind, moving toward them. He ran back to the shack. "We have to go, now." Panic flashed in Mara's eyes. Lena stood frozen, her gaze fixed on a small locked shed beside the house. "Mama's things," she said, her voice tight. "Her letters. The things from before." "There's no time, Lena," Jesse said, his voice firm, but he saw the look on her face, the agony of losing everything all over again. "Get the mule ready," he ordered. "Hitch the wagon, go." Before they could protest, he was moving. He kicked the shed's flimsy door in. Inside, a small wooden box and a heavy patchwork quilt sat against the back wall. He grabbed them both, the scent of dried lavender and old memories rising from the disturbed air, and sprinted back to the wagon as the first flakes of ash began to drift down like a gray, malevolent snow. They rode out with the fire roaring at their heels, a monstrous living thing that devoured trees and spat embers at the sky. They didn't look back. Behind them, the world was being consumed. Mara wept silently. Lena stared straight ahead, her face a stoic mask, her knuckles white where she gripped the side of the wagon. "There's nothing left now," she said quietly into the smoke-filled air. "Nothing at all." That night, they camped by a creek, the only place the fire hadn't touched. The sky above was a bruised purple, starless and grim. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their loss a tangible thing, I thought. "If we could just get back there," Lena finally whispered, "that things would be right again." Jesse stared into the small fire he'd built, its flames a pale imitation of the inferno on the ridge. "A fire like that," he said, his voice rough, "it just clears out the deadwood. It can't touch the roots, not if they're deep enough." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, considering his words not as comfort, but as a hard truth. The next morning, a grim curiosity pulled them back. The shack was gone. Only a blackened chimney and smoldering timbers remained. As Lena picked through the debris, her foot nudged a scorched book. She knelt and pried it open. Inside, protected by the thick pages, was her drawing. The paper was singed at the edges, but the two small figures holding hands were untouched. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I guess it didn't get everything," she said. As they packed what little they had salvaged, Mara turned to Jesse. "That ranch of yours," she said, her voice hesitant. "Is there room enough?" He looked at the two of them, mother and daughter, covered in soot and loss, yet standing. He looked at the vast empty landscape around them, one step at a time. "Mara," he said gently, placing the precious drawing into a saddlebag. First, let's get home. Then we'll see what's left standing. They saw the smoke from a mile out, a thin, lazy column rising where it had no right to be. It wasn't the billowing plume of a wildfire, but the greasy black smoke of something man-made. As they drew closer, a bitter scent hit them, not just of burned wood, but of kerosene. The fence line was a ruin of charred posts, some still hissing faintly. This wasn't the indifferent work of nature. This was the deliberate signature of hate. Jesse dismounted, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Mara let out a small strangled cry, but Lena was silent. She slid down from the mule, her small feet landing softly in the ash, and her eyes, hard as flint, took in the destruction. Inside the house, chaos reigned. Furniture was overturned, crockery shattered. The small cedar chest his wife had brought to this house lay in the center of the room, its lid hacked open with an axe. Its contents dried flowers, a few letters, a baby's bonnet strewn across the floor like insults. And on the wall, scrawled in charcoal from the fireplace, was a single, jagged word: thief. Mara covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking, but Lena stepped past her. She ran a single soot-stained finger over the black letters. "This is just fear they're selling, Jesse," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "I'm not buying it anymore." The girl who had once feared a locked door was gone. In her place stood someone forged in fire and fury. Without another word, she began to pick up the scattered linens. Jesse watched her for a moment, then went outside and returned with his hammer. He started rebuilding the front step, each nail driven home with a sharp, punctuating blow. They didn't speak of despair. They answered it with work. By midday, the sound of a wagon interrupted their labor. It was Hank Sutter. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He just held up a burlap sack. "Heard you might have some mending to do," he said, the sack clinking with the sound of nails. "Brought a few extra hands." Behind him, two more neighbors appeared, one carrying fresh planks, the other a length of coiled wire. Before long, a half-dozen men from surrounding ranches were there. No one asked what had happened. They simply saw what needed to be done. They raised fence posts, stretched wire, and shared water from a communal barrel. Their silent, steady work a bulwark against the ugliness that had visited this place. Caleb Dawes arrived as the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the newly mended fence. He rode in alone, a sour grin on his face, clearly expecting to find a scene of broken spirits. Instead, he found a community. "Well now, Boone," he sneered, dismounting. "Looks like you're throwing a party." Jesse stopped his work and walked toward him, his hammer still hanging from his hand. He didn't say a word. "You think a new fence changes anything?" Caleb taunted, his eyes flicking toward Mara, who stood hesitantly on the porch. "You really want to build a life with another man's ruined leftovers?" Lena moved before Jesse could. She walked down the steps, her face pale but her eyes burning. She stopped directly in front of Caleb Dawes, a man twice her size, and she slapped him. The sound was sharp and clean, a crack that echoed through the sudden silence of the yard. Every hammer stopped. Every man turned to watch. Caleb's face flushed a dark mottled red. He raised a hand, his expression murderous. "Why, you little—" "You will not talk about my mother," Lena said, her voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of iron. "And you will not step on this land again." "That's not wildness you're looking at, Dawes," Jesse said, stepping up beside Lena, his presence a solid wall. "That's courage. It's a rare thing." Caleb's hand twitched toward his belt, but he stopped. He was one man. And all around him, a dozen silent men stood, their tools held loosely in their hands, their eyes watching him. They weren't threatening him. They didn't have to. He was utterly, completely alone. He backed away, mounted his horse with a clumsy, jerky motion, and pointed a trembling finger at Jesse. This ain't over." "Yes," Jesse said, his voice calm and final. "It is." Caleb stared for a moment longer into the wall of silent, judging faces, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his retreat a cloud of ignominious dust. When he was gone, Lena turned to Jesse, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her hands still shook. "I was scared," she admitted in a whisper. Jesse looked down at her, a flicker of something fierce and proud in his eyes. "I know," he said. "But your feet didn't move an inch." The neighbors departed as the first stars pricked the deep purple of the evening sky, leaving behind them the scent of fresh-cut pine, a mended fence, and the quiet solidarity of good people. The three of them were left alone in the circle of warm light spilling from the cabin door. They ate a simple meal of rabbit stew, the silence between them no longer one of caution, but of comfort. Later, as Lena helped clear the plates, Mara began to hum, then to sing a low, sweet lullaby from a time before memory was a painful thing. Lena, who had once been as taut as a wire, slowly leaned her head against her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes. Jesse watched them from his chair on the porch, the familiar ache in his back for once a dull and distant thing. He looked at the light in his window, at the two figures within, and felt a profound shift deep in his chest. For 5 years, this place had been a shelter, a collection of rooms where he slept and ate. Tonight, for the first time since his wife's passing, it felt like a home. He leaned his head back against the rough-hewn post and let his own eyes drift shut, unafraid of what the darkness might hold. Later, when Mara had turned in, Lena came out onto the porch. She stood beside his chair, looking up at the vast star-dusted sky. "Jesse," she asked softly, "do you think, am I still broken?" He didn't answer right away. He rose, went into the small shed, and returned with a smooth, gray whetstone, worn into a gentle curve from years of use. It had been his wife's, a tool she used to keep her kitchen knives and garden shears perfectly sharp. He placed it in Lena's hands. It was cool and solid. "We're all cracked in places, Lena," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's just the price of living. But a crack doesn't make a thing useless. Sometimes it's how you find out what it's really made of." He tapped the stone in her hand. "What matters is that you learn how to put an edge back on. How to be useful again, for yourself." She closed her fingers around the stone, holding it tight. And in the faint starlight, he saw her smile. Not a smile of amusement or relief, but one of quiet understanding. Time smoothed over the sharp edges of memory. The seasons turned. The story of the girl tied to a post faded, replaced by new stories. Stories of Lena's stubborn garden that produced tomatoes in the driest years. Stories of her steady hand with a needle and thread. When people in town spoke of the folks at Boone's ranch, they spoke of the quiet man, the resilient woman who was his wife, and the daughter who had her mother's grit and Jesse's unblinking gaze. Years later, a young woman rode into town on the wagon, her hair braided down her back. She stopped at the mercantile to sign for supplies, flour, seed, and a bolt of blue cotton. The clerk turned the ledger toward her. She picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and in a hand that was now firm and clear, wrote her name. "Lena, not Dawes," she wrote. "Lena Boone." He had offered a roof to a ghost. And in doing so, she and her mother had offered him a life. They had rebuilt a home not just of timber, but of bone. And as he watched her from the porch now, waiting for her return, Jesse Boone no longer felt like a ghost in his own house. He was simply a man waiting for his daughter to come home.